Well, thank you guys so much for joining. Um, so I am a legal philosopher, as was mentioned. I'm sure that there aren't that many legal philosophers who come to this workshop. I'm sure because there's not that many legal philosophers working in this space, which is really too bad because it's a very exciting time to be a legal philosopher thinking about technology. Obviously, there's all kinds of new questions. I guess since it's like such an intimate space, I want to ask, how many of you guys have some background in intellectual property? Okay, great. I figured. So I would give a little bit of background in intellectual property. How many of you guys have philosophy backgrounds? A little bit, cool, yeah. So I'm a philosopher of intellectual property. That's like my entry point. That's where I sort of started thinking about these sort of theoretical questions around information. Just kind of struck me that, property is philosophically interesting. Intellectual property is like this metaphysically abstract, expressive stuff. What's going on there? And I figured that there was probably like a lot of underexplored philosophical questions underlying this space. But what I started to realize, I wrote a philosophy PhD thesis about copyright, and I started to really feel like, intellectual property scholars are sort of siloed in a very insular conversation where we act as though like intellectual property is this real category in the world, and it's different kinds of information stuff. Then what's that issue with privacy, and what's that issue with defamation, and some of the kinds of things, and obviously data privacy, and in the information age, we're seeing all kinds of new versions of intellectual artifacts, information entities. This is the language that I'm going to use to describe the subject matter of all these areas of law. And it's not exactly clear what's underlying the lines that we have drawn. Why does some stuff get treated as property, intellectual property, and other stuff does not? And so I kind of found myself zooming out and trying to look at what the reasons are that people give for, understanding certain kinds of information artifacts as property and recognizing them with property rights and pretty strong property rights on the one hand, and seemingly excluding other kinds of information entities and some of the stuff that, like the ISP is more interested in thinking about, things about privacy, things about information. Why isn't that sort of a part of, why aren't these conversations happening together? And is this really, a sensible distinction? And so, I started to zoom out from just copyright, just intellectual property, to learn more about these other areas of law. This was like while I was, doing my my PhD research. And I noticed that there was this weird, striking pattern emerging across different areas of American legal institutions structuring our rights in information. And what I observed is, to put it very reductively, this property-speech dichotomy. So what do I mean by this? And this is something that whatever domain of information law you have some exposure to, you might find this sort of resonant with something that you've learned in the past. But the basic idea is, in an information dispute, in a paradigmatic information law dispute, the dispute is an information control claim on the one hand and a speech claim on the other hand. That's just like what it means to have an information dispute, right? Like the information is speech, and so when you're trying to control it, the countervailing claim is a speech claim. And what I observed is that, American law across all these different legal institutions, and this isn't, we know about American jurisprudence, it's not the most surprising thing in the world, but we are very ready to suppress speech, as it were, when the claim that's being made, the information claim that's being made, is an economic interest. It's a property interest. You can understand it as a market right. But when it's a non-economic information interest that is trying to be vindicated by someone who's trying to claim control, we're much less, then we say, no, it's speech. We can't do this. This is a speech restriction, and we really care about speech. So to make this less abstract, I'll run through a few examples that highlight the pattern that really got me interested in this question. So, first starting with copyright law, which was sort of my initial playground. In America, copyright law is understood. Copyrights are understood as a very economic right. And what this means is that a lot of courts and scholars really don't like it when authors use their copyright to control the dissemination of a work, rather than to just get lost profits or a licensing fee. They think it's an inappropriate use of copyright to try to prevent the work from being used in a certain context. So think about things like, whatever, I'm a musician and my music is being played at a Trump rally and I really don't like this. A lot of really sort of highly focused on the intellectual property space scholars think that it is a complete misuse of copyright for me to be able to stop that from happening. All I am entitled to is a lost profit or a lost licensing fee. That is the sort of general paradigm. And, it's not obvious, why, at first glance, why that is. And usually what's said is, ultimately what we care about is disseminating information. That's what grounds copyright law. We've got these competing free speech claims. We don't want to suppress that. All we're willing to do is give you lost profits. Okay, this goes further. This is just, within one particular context of law. Once you step outside of it, you see it across sort of different areas of law that are really kind of capturing similar things, but understanding them as property rather than as a sort of non-economic interest. So, the next example, publicity rights. You guys know about the right of publicity? Some nods. Okay, I feel like this is a kind of bridge example of intellectual property. So, the right of publicity, it's a state-based right, and so it varies a little bit, but what it basically is a right to control your name, likeness, image, when basically it has market value. So it's typically, a lot of celebrities, it's required that you are famous, or in a lot of states, it's required that you're famous or a celebrity. Certainly you need to have market value. And it's for commercial uses of your identity. What this means is celebrities are able to kind of control their image. Maybe they're doing it not for economic reasons, but because they want to control their image because it has market value. On the other hand, ordinary folk like you and me are much more limited in our ability to control our image. Obviously, privacy and defamation law have been in many ways swamped by the First Amendment, but then we all know that otherwise there's very limited protection. And straightforwardly, a lot of these sorts of market value requirements just foreclose people who are really only have a colorable non-economic claim in their image and likeness from being able to actually protect it. And again, the argument you see is we care about free speech. So we have a couple other examples. So trade secrets are another area of intellectual property. I hate using this phrase because I think it's meaningless, but I will use it to refer to these categories. Trade secrets are economically valuable bits of information where their economic value comes from their secrecy. They are very, very highly protected. But of course, as we know, personal data, information privacy that's personal, not in the sense that you're actually trying to make money out of it, but you have a different kind of stake in it. Again, comparatively, very, very underprotected, whereas trade secrets are, very, very seriously protected. And a final example I give are trademarks versus attribution rights. Trademarks are, they're identifying marks of commercial actors. People who are selling things in the marketplace, and the story is that this is good for consumer search costs because people know what they're buying. But of course, what ends up happening is that because Coca-Cola can sort of prevent anyone from free riding on their goodwill, it ends up being an effective tool for actually protecting their goodwill, protecting their reputation, and associating the things that they put out there with themselves. But on the other hand, again, ordinary individuals, we have very few attribution rights. So this is effectively an attribution right, right? And the only context where we recognize attribution rights in the United States is really visual art, VERA, the Visual Artists' Rights Act. It's begrudging. We only did it because we had to, because the international law community was like, you gotta recognize something, right? And so that is like something we begrudgingly accept in this one context. And it's, I pair these things together because in all these cases, there's something similar at stake. The information entity itself is a similar kind of thing. It's like basically a name, or it's basically some private information, or it's basically your image. But how it's used or valued is what's different. And so what's striking about this is, I observed this pattern that, there, on the one hand, there's this economic interest, like America, you don't even hear that much talk about how there is a competing speech claim because we're comfortable. I mean, copyright law just is a speech limitation. That is just what it is, right? But we've already accepted that, these are the kinds of contexts where it's fine to limit speech because there's this economic interest that we are favoring. That is just as a matter of course, we're not debating that anymore. But when it's a non-economic interest, we're very concerned about speech. And because that's the rhetoric that's on the other side, it's almost as though, this dichotomy is casting this shadow on when we think speech is at stake in an important way and when we don't. But just taking a step back, given that these are the same kinds of information, they're both names, they're both secrets or, private information, they're both images. It's not obvious why, there would be a compelling speech interest on the one hand, but there isn't even anything worth talking about on the other hand. We don't even need to have that conversation. So, observing this and also seeing the sort of trans-substantive nature of this pattern, it goes beyond intellectual property, it goes into all these other areas of law. I started to wonder, is this justified? Is it really is there a good reason, for saying that only property can trump speech? Or are we really just, missing the right conceptual normative framework for recognizing and analyzing non-economic information interests? That should also sometimes trump speech. Do we not even have the right framework for thinking about this? And so the way that this all began was, it was very common law in the beginning where I was like, let me identify one non-economic interest that American law does recognize protections in, and that's the body. We're very comfortable with that. And let me see if, starting with the interests that we have in our bodies, we can build out to construct a framework for recognizing non-economic information interests. And this is what I call the extended self. So that's just to kind of set the motivational sort of framework and the sort of story of how I got here. Now, I want to sort of talk about how there are all of these scholarly interventions that are also identifying the dichotomy that I just described, but they are really kind of focused on particular instances of it. So they'll identify this problem as it arises in the right of publicity or personal data or copyright. They'll zoom in on one dimension of it. And they really say extended selfie type stuff without really explicitly articulating it. or really kind of defending it, but it's in the background of a lot of what we do see. So just as some examples, so Jennifer Rothman has written about publicity rights, and she's argued that it should really be an inalienable right, that we have these autonomy, dignity, interests. This is the language that you see all the time. We have an autonomy, dignity, personhood interest in this information entity. And they'll say that, and they'll talk about that in publicity rights, privacy, and copyright, and all these targeted contexts, attribution. And so I think that this scholarship is kind of, glomming onto an extended self style thing. I found it to be sort of unsatisfying, or at least incomplete, for a few different reasons. So the reasons, to sort of summarize them, one, as I said, these are domain-specific interventions, right of publicity, privacy, but I actually think this is a trans-substantive theoretical problem, and we should look into a sort of trans-substantive theoretical response. And as it turns out, it actually goes beyond information. And that's something that I'll get into in sort of describing how the project has evolved into this crazy, what is a person project. Another sort of frustrating thing about this scholarship is that it's often drawing on ideas of philosophers like Locke and Kant and Hegel in order to make its autonomy, dignity, personhood argument. And this gives the impression, at least in debate, that you have to be a Kantian, like Lockean, Hegelian in order to buy that there should be recognition of these non-economic information interests. And I think that's wrong. And I think that, all you need to buy, which is the structure of the argument, is the very same interests, whatever those are, that you think we have in our bodies, whether you think we recognize them for economic reasons, the efficiency reasons, all the way down, even though they're non-economic interests, otherwise consequentialist reasons, or because you're a Lockean, Hegelian, Kantian, whatever the reason is. I just want to show you that what's at stake when we're protecting our bodies, that same thing is often at stake when we're considering information interests. And the last piece of it that's kind of frustrating is, a lot of scholarship just says, this is also very related, says there's an autonomy, dignity, personhood interest in this information, but doesn't say why. Why is there such an interest? And that's the whole debate, right? The other side is denying precisely that. They're saying, no, there isn't. It's speech. And so what you have are these very frustrating, debates among scholars where they're just talking past each other, where, one person is saying, yeah, this is autonomy, and the other person is saying, no, it's not. What are you talking about? This is just speech, information. This is information. Information wants to be free. And there's a missing step, I think, in explaining and defending why there is an autonomy, dignity, personhood interest, sometimes, in some cases, in our information. And so a way to think about this is a way of responding to the question, why and when, if at all, is there such an interest? And I think in order to make this claim, you need this unarticulated, undefended, but key premise, which is because information is sometimes a part of ourselves. That's what you need to make this claim in order for it to actually sort of carry weight. Now, you can't just claim that, right? You got to argue for it. But that's the missing piece. And so part of what I think of myself as trying to do is, seeing this pattern and then seeing the sort of scholarly interventions as particular areas of law and trying to kind of fill in what I think is missing, which is this kind of trans-substantive theoretical framework for just thinking about these questions. And trying to motivate the idea that it really is. And in particular that, there are these contexts where we can see that something outside of our bodies, including information things, has the very same interest at stake with something that we already protect as to our bodies. And so there's no good reason for the law to be treating these two things differently. So that was the kind of original frame. And I called it the extended self because I'm drawing inspiration from this analogy to this idea of David Chalmers and Andy Clark called the extended mind. Does anyone know about the extended mind thesis? Okay, great. So I'm going to tell you this argument that I think is very cool, and then I'm going to tell you how I'm, whatever, the Chatterjee version of the argument in thinking about the self. Okay, so Chalmers and Clark are philosophers of mind, and they defend this idea, the extended mind thesis. They defended this a very long time ago, and it's obviously, extremely relevant to thinking about today. And the claim is there is no good reason to think that the boundaries of our minds are identical to or limited by the boundaries of our brain. And the way that the argument goes is, imagine two cases. Person X forms the intention to go to the Met Museum, remembers the address of the Met Museum, and then goes to that address. Now, person Y has Alzheimer's and carries around a notebook that contains all of the information that they need in order to be able to go around and function in their daily life. They also form the intention to go to the Met Museum. They look up the address in their notebook, and then they go to that address. Now, Chalmers and Clark's contention is that there's no good reason for saying that biological memory is a part of the mind as to person X, but the notebook is not a part of the mind as to person Y, because both are playing the very same role in their cognition. So they think, the mind includes, in the case of person Y, the notebook, because it's just doing the very same thing as biological memory for person X. And the implication of this is that our minds, our cognition, are often not limited to our brains. Okay, so that's their argument. Now, it depends on, as a metaphysical thesis, which is not what I'm interested in so much, but I will sort of explain why. As a metaphysical thesis, this argument depends on a particular view about what minds are. And this is called functionalism. And this is the view that minds and mental states are not defined by their material constitution. They're defined by the functional role being played by these different mental states. And what this means is minds are multiply realizable. They can be made from different materials. And I won't go into all that literature because it's a massive literature, but that's what's going on in the background here. And they're going from there and they're showing, and in the case of us humans, it's extending beyond our brains all the time when things are operating at that functional role. Okay, my claim is that if you destroy Y's notebook, this is not like the harm of conversion or the harm of property destruction or theft. What it's like is the harm of a battery, where it causes brain damage and memory loss. That is the effect that this has. This person can no longer use what is functionally their memory. I think it is a mistake for the law in this scenario to see this as conversion, when it's really like a battery. And so that is a normative claim. It's not a metaphysical claim, which is why I get to kind of avoid all of the metaphysical weirdness that's at issue with Chalmers and Clark, because I am just saying, yeah, precisely because this plays the same functional role, that is the harm that is caused by this. And, similarly, it suggests a functionalist theory, not of the mind, but of legal persons. Now, I say legal persons because I'm talking about sort of the normative contours of a person, which is what the law is ultimately interested in. And I want to say that, but this didn't start off as a project about what the legal person is, but, the project that I just described to you, and then, I'll go over sort of the examples, but I started to use different examples to show like this phenomenon that I just described of person X's notebook getting destroyed, and it's really like a battery. We can see all kinds of examples of this, and I'll give you more where it's the same thing going on, and there's information at stake. But I started to present this paper, throughout like the legal academy, and basically, like I was seeing, as I'm a philosopher, I think about information, and I was having all kinds of law professors be like, this paper isn't just about information, or this isn't just about private rights and information. Crim pro people were like, this is a self-incrimination paper. This is a search and seizure paper. Disability law people were like, this is a disability law paper. Everyone had a application to their area of law. We can see this in all these different contexts, and it was this kind of amazing thing where it just goes to show how unfortunate it is that legal scholars are often so silent, and it just dawned on me that I needed to go back to basics. The question of sort of what the legal person itself really is. Now, before sort of going to that question, and I hope I'm doing good on time, right? Still a lot of time. Okay, yeah, before I went straight to that question, I want to give you some more examples to kind of motivate the intuition. Because I just gave you one example, and it's a very stylized example of the Alzheimer's patient and then notebook. But here are some other examples, and some of these examples we already see glimmers of in the law, which is a part of what the sort of legal person story is gonna capture. So I teach torts, and one of the things that was sort of very helpful or synergistic in thinking about this problem is that there's a very famous torts case. Fisher, do you guys know this case? It's an offensive battery case. A man, he's an African-American man, he's a NASA scientist. He's at a banquet at a hotel that's celebrating his achievements, and one of the hotel employees sees him and says, you're not allowed to be here, and snatches the plate out of his hands. He's holding a plate and makes a racist remark. And there's these two pieces of this case. One is the offensive battery piece of it, but the other is, there wasn't direct physical contact with his body. There was contact with the plate that he was holding. And the court says, in some contexts, functional extensions of your body, damage to them is effectively like damage to your body. If it's something you're holding, maybe it's your clothes. I think some of the most striking examples of this is if you walk with a walking stick and someone, kicks you in your walking stick, that's a battery. Someone does damage to, some other, your wheelchair, that's a battery. And this is sort of recognizing in tort law these glimmers of these contexts where it's yeah, because that is kind of like an extension of you, even though it's not literally your human body understood in this biological sense, right? So we see glimmers of it in these places already. Some other sort of stylized sort of examples, if someone were to read my diary or eavesdrop on my therapy session, I kind of think the harm would be similar to if someone were to develop a mind reading technology and used it without my consent. Because I think I'm working out my thoughts here, this is me thinking, and it's really kind of the same. It's not material, but it's not my physical body. Revenge porn. So I am of the view that unauthorized use of sexual imagery is the same harm as, if someone were, say, looking in on my window while I was changing. It's not material that what they're looking at is not directly my body. They're looking at an extension of my body. It's the same harm. I have a couple other examples that I can just throw out. One is, if someone makes defamatory statements or like publicity rights violations that are like associating you with views that you don't have, I think it's kind of like the harm of compelled speech. They're not literally forcing you, your physical person, to, affirm these things that you don't believe, but they are associating your identity with, your extended identity with these views that you don't have. And then the last example I give is like in a hypothetical future where like we all just like lived most of our day-to-day lives in the virtual realm, in the metaverse. If we really did start living our lives in this realm, then our interests, the very same interests that we have in like our physical home, our physical, expression, all of these different things would start to be implicated there. And it just like doesn't really matter so much that it's information. What matters is the role that's being played. Okay, so, those are some examples. You might find some of them more or less compelling, but for me, like the threshold is just, if I can get you to find even one of them compelling, then we can see that that there are these contexts where the two things are not aligned. So, the move from the extended self or the extended mind to the extended self is, whether or not you buy this like metaphysical picture, I think that when things play a certain role in our self-constitution, they might implicate the very same interests that we already recognize as to our bodies. And when this happens, there is no good reason for the law to be treating it differently. That is the sort of basic model. Now, why do I like this approach, or why was I drawn to this approach? A part of it was a little bit, strategic. It is obviously trans-substantive. It's my attempt at, filling that, motivating that missing premise that, yeah, there can be an autonomy, dignity, personhood, interest, because it's a part of you, which is like what's missing, and that's where the action is. That's what we should be debating. Is that true? In this case, is it a part of you? And as I said, it's neutral on the sort of Kantian, Hegelian, Lockean stuff. You could be like a total consequentialist and think that like it's bad to kick someone in their leg, and for the very same reason, it's bad to kick someone in like a walking stick that they use. It's because it's all about this sort of functional normative role. Now, so as I said, this became, as I was presenting this, just got more and more and more fundamental. And I started to realize that this was really what I really wanted to defend, was a theory of the legal person. A theory of the legal person as not something that, the individual legal person as not something that is necessarily constrained to the human body. And the way that I have started to do this in sort of like paper one of this series is going back to basics and saying, like trying to use corporations to my advantage, saying, okay, let's take seriously that there's these two things that we call legal persons: human individuals and corporations. And let's think through what follows about the nature of legal persons and what should follow about our vision of sort of individual, human legal persons. And, the view that I defend is functionalist in the sense of what the philosophers of mind mean, which is the view that legal persons are not ever things that are defined by their material constitution. They are always defined by their functional structure. So it's going further. It's a functionalist theory of the legal person. A legal person is not equivalent. My legal person is not equivalent to my human body. And I argue that this, this follows from, taking seriously the fact that we're fine with that in corporations. And this is the only way to sort of make sense of, and there isn't a good reason to say that is, permissible as an account of corporations. Now, this sort of theory of legal persons has implications for a lot of areas of law, but it's sort of step one, going all the way back. I started with the initial motivation, but as I said, presenting this around everywhere, I really saw that like lots of people thought that this had implications. And so let me just quickly summarize, and please tell me like when I need to start, when you think I should switch over to Q&A, because I don't remember how late we started. But let me give you like the quick overview of the functionalist argument, and then we'll have, you know, sort of all the pieces on the table to play with. So why do I think we should embrace this view? Well, corporations are certainly functionalist entities, which is to say that they're certainly not defined by their material constitution. They're defined by their functional structures and roles. And the way that you can see this, you know, the core test for functionalism is that the thing can be wholly materially reconstituted, but as long as its functional structure is preserved, it's the same thing. We see this with corporations all the time, right? Like corporations can live for hundreds and hundreds of years with entirely, you know, completely different particular human individuals that constitute them as the same corporation, because it's not about the particular human individuals that are defining corporate personhood. It's about this structure. So I think we should take this seriously. And actually what's interesting is I do think we see glimmers of it in the individual legal person case. We just don't fully embrace it explicitly. So, you know, I already gave you the example of in tort law and batteries. There's other examples from tort law where we see functional extensions of the person being treated as a part of them. The law will deviate from the boundaries of the human individual, the material constitution, when functional considerations demand it. It just so happens that, like, at least up till now, these two things have tended to overlap. What are some other examples of this? You know, vicarious liability, agency law. These are contexts where the law is within, you know, within a particular time and place, redrawing the line of your legal personhood to incorporate some other human individual. And that is a functionalist redrawing. You know, the law is very comfortable with deviating from this. Obviously, corporations themselves are these contexts where our individual legal personhood is alienated from us because we have now become, in that context, a part of the corporate person. I give some other examples. I won't go into all of them just for the interest of time. I can share these slides, though. And, you know, the claim of this first paper is it's normatively desirable for legal persons to be defined by their functional structures rather than their material constitution, because we're interested in tracking what matters. The law is interested in normative reality. And whereas in the law of corporations, we fully internalize this, we haven't internalized it in our thinking about human individuals. And I think that's a part of what's coming up with, you know, failure to be more imaginative about how we understand our information rights. Now, I think this is like not only conceptually concerning, it's actually normatively very concerning, because what it has entailed is that the law's vision of corporate personhood is like able to be nimble, ever expanding, whereas the law's vision of individual legal personhood is very stringent and limited. It's just your human body. Like, that's kind of maddening, because there doesn't seem to be a good reason that we're willing to go functionalist consistently in this one context, but we're not able to see that in the other context. You know, I think failing to sort of generally internalize this, and this is a whole like other rant, which you can ask about if you want to. I think it's both obscuring that corporate personhood is artificial, and that's why we get things like Citizens United, and also it's, you know, restricting the vision of human personhood. There's no reason that it has to be our bodies. We've already decided that when we decided that corporations could exist. Okay, so, you know, the thesis of this paper is the law should take this seriously. And, you know, this means what this requires is going beyond our bodies, extending persons and personal rights. And this is some of the stuff that comes up, that sort of more directly takes us back to where we started, which is recognizing information interests. And, in the subsequent paper, like this is the first paper is really like a philosophy paper called The Functionalist Theory of Legal Persons. Subsequent paper is really sort of teasing out different implications of this for different areas of law, including information law. But I think one sort of very important implication of this is when I say we need to recognize extended legal persons, what that means is we need to recognize non-property rights in things that are outside of our bodies. Things outside of our bodies tend to be treated as either property or as not protected. And we should be recognizing, and it's not always the case. So, visual arts, like, this inalienable right, this context where we do see, or our reputations, we already see this in certain glimmers, but we need to start recognizing non-property rights more systematically in things outside of our bodies. And I give this analogy to some of the self-ownership literature, where it's like, it's not that I own parts of my body, it's that they are mine. And that is the relationship that we should start recognizing, which is a very different kind of right. There's a couple other implications that sort of go beyond the initial motivations of the paper that I'll just put on the table. So one is that it has to do with mental states. So once we've gone functionalist, I think it follows that these mental state requirements in the law, we see them everywhere. Whether it's intent, malice, voluntary action, recklessness, consent, collusion. We see all these mental state requirements, and there's a puzzle. And this is something that I wrote about like 6 years ago, I think, with G.D. Frommer, in totally like hypothetical, but now is like ever more relevant as we imagine artificial actors, AI actors or other kinds of technology. And there's this question that a lot of scholars are interested in, which is, can AI satisfy mental state requirements? Can AI collude? Can they act with malice? I think, yeah, they can, if it has the right functional role. Because this is not about the material, constitution, and it's not even about consciousness. It's about the structure. So artificial sentient minds. The last thing is, I think, sort of beyond corporations, we should take seriously whether there are other collective persons that we should be recognizing. There's no good why just corporations? That's one solution to one problem. And the reason I flag this is I think, especially in the information law space, you see these examples where people are identifying information right considerations, problems, and they say that private individual rights cannot solve this problem. So we have discourse about traditional knowledge. We have discourse about, my good friend Salome Wilhelm has this amazing paper on the relational theory of data governance, which says the harms of datafication are not reducible to individuals, but legal persons don't need to be individuals. We let corporations do this to solve one problem. We should be more imaginative. Now, okay, the last thing I'll say, this is the last slide I have, just to put some further questions on the table. So this opens, the way that I understand this move, this functionalist extension of the legal person, is that it sort of opens the door to thinking about ourselves in a lot of different ways. And, obviously the big question that's at the front is what are the boundaries of this? And I have completely sort of evaded this question because, like I said, for now, my goal is the threshold. If I can get you to agree with me that it sometimes goes beyond, then we're on the same page. Now we can have that boundary question. I haven't sort of figured out how I want to deal with that because I'm working on these papers. But I would actually, if anyone has thoughts on the way to think about that, I would welcome them. It has to do with, it connects to this harms and remedies stuff. So obviously here, one big puzzle that keeps arising in privacy law, I'm thinking about data, is this idea of harm as a requirement for, standing in federal courts. And there's this question of like when something should count as harms. And I say, yeah, there can be intangible harms because persons are intangible. And so it's not weird to say this. There's some further questions that I've been sort of starting to puzzle over. And they have to do with future selves, posthumous selves, recreated selves, and artificial selves. So I'm just going to do a quick sort of survey of this. Future selves. So one project that I have in the works, I've been thinking a lot about what is disturbing about, let's call it perfect prediction. Let's call it the minority report problem. Like a lot of scholarship is working on like the concerns around AI because it's like bad data, it's biased, the models are bad. I think that there's something to be really concerned about if we imagine it being good. I don't like it. I don't like the idea of it being good, right? And I feel like I have a kind of interest in my future self and like what she's up to. And there's a question of, is it just an ordinary privacy interest? Like I have an interest in my present self. Do I not have an interest in that? Do I have a stronger interest in that? And I happen to have the intuition that I have a stronger interest in that. For reasons that, again, I can say when we have like a few minutes for questions. Posthumous selves. So, there's this great puzzle in philosophy about whether you can wrong the dead, whether you can harm the dead. Who are you harming? They have died, right? And the posthumous stuff is interesting because in the law, whereas publicity rights, because they're understood as property rights, do survive deaths. Your children inherit them. Defamation does not. Can't defame the dead. I happen to think that it would be really bad. It would be harming me if someone defamed me after I died. And I'm playing with this idea that maybe our extended selves have half-lives. Once we extend ourselves beyond our bodies, like, yeah, our bodies die, but the rest of us sticks around for a little while. I like this as a response to the philosophical puzzle because it captures an intuition that a lot of people have, which is it would be bad harming me to defame me a few months after I died. Less bad, potentially not bad at all, to defame me like a million years from now because my extended self is gone. That's my intuition. Resurrected, recreated selves. So this is this phenomenon that's happening already, which is like AI models, reconstructing real people. Have you guys seen Black Mirror? Some nods, some light nods. Okay. Well, I just wrote this piece over the summer for the Boston Review that sort of uses, this episode came out 10 years ago where a woman loses her husband tragically very early, and she gets contacted by this AI company who says, we can actually give you an artificial version of your husband. And she starts talking to this chat bot. She starts hanging out with him. It's like very disturbing, probably because you can really kind of feel the allure. Like if you tragically just like lost someone you love, it'd be very tempting. This is happening now. Like there are startups that are selling artificial resurrections of real people. And I think, there's a question of like what stake we have in that. And then there's a question of just like artificial beings generally. Okay, that's everything. I hope that I haven't gone over time. No, I guess we've done okay. I will open things up for any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, this was really interesting and a really good presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I have several. What's the purchase of labeling the interest at stake as body interests? Right, I mean, like that just gives me the sense that maybe you're a Kantian and you care a lot about body. But like, I don't know if you've read any of Scanlon's work on his speech, but
yeah,
it would be really parsimonious way of thinking about these issues of just saying, I have an interest in X, Y, or Z, and you don't really gain anything by calling it a body interest, or autonomy interest, or dignitary interest, or what have you.
Yeah.
I wonder what do we get from calling it a body interest?
It's a great question. Do you want me to? I guess you can just like throw out a bunch of them or a few of them. We can talk after as well.
Let's take one more. Why the urge for universality? So why not just be maybe a pure functionalist, saying that there are kind of these policy or normative
Mhm.
considerations we have at stake in when we define a legal concept, and we just be a pure functionalist about it. In this context, define a legal person this way. The tracks are the relevant normative considerations, but in other contexts,
Yeah.
what do we get from the universality of the
Yeah, great. So two great questions. So I will say that the motivation for the body, now, so I'm not a Kantian, I'll say, like important. I mean, I'm a level-headed deontic person. I like the scan on stuff. The reason that I went that way, it was very sort of interlocutor motivated. It was me trying to exploit a foothold in existing American law, which is that we can all agree on this one non-economic interest. Like, you don't need to be a contractualist, you don't need to be, you know, a content, like we all agree about this. And I think that sort of made me feel like that's where we should start, even just as a matter of like common law reasoning, like to build outward. But I think, you know, I'm on board with this idea of, you know, there could be a lot of different like normative frameworks that you could use to sort of describe the nature of the interest that we're talking about. And I totally agree that that's like one approach that you could have. I wanted to remain sort of agnostic on what the nature of the interest is, basically as a rhetorical move. But it's a kind of weird, I'm vacillating on it just because I think, and I think sort of the move to the legal person is actually kind of a move away from that, because it is a kind of more, it's a more sort of nimble conception of like what kinds of personal interests that aren't so fixated on the body, and then it's actually trying to abandon the body. And so it's a kind of genealogical story of like, that's where I began with the body for the reason that I just gave, but I don't know how, you know, that might be like the ladder that I'm going to kick out from underneath me. In this, even just the functional paper. Yeah, I agree with the example that you give, and I actually think, and this is something I didn't get into, which is, I do think we should be pure functionalist about what the boundaries are that we draw, which is, in my mind, a way of having unity. The unity arises at the level of what the legal person is, rather than at the level of like, it has like then upstream implications for all these different areas of law. But then what those implications are depend on sort of getting into the nitty-gritty details. And I think this is what's at issue with my inability to give a sort of satisfying answer to people who want to be like, what's the boundary? Because I want to be like, it depends. It depends on, you know, the area, the interest at stake, what the purposes of this sort of area of law, like what we're trying to do, which is kind of, I have found to be kind of an unsatisfying answer to people. But that's kind of why I do want the sort of vision of, but I think the main thing that I'm very attached to is the sort of fundamentality of this functionalist approach to thinking about the legal person, and really a functionalist approach, or not even, I wouldn't say functionalist approach, but an instrumentalist approach to thinking about legal metaphysics, just in general. Hopefully that is somewhat satisfying. Yeah, anyone else? Yeah?
Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it. And very thoughtful. So much reading this stuff going on. So I wanted to just clarify a couple of moves that I didn't really follow. Okay, I understand the part where you say the person should be extended so that we get information rights. That sounds good to me, and I can get on board, and I see all the motivation to do it. Then at some point you say, I think we speak about the legal person.
Mm-hmm.
Not only the person should be extended for us to be extended, even though that sounded like.
Mm-hmm.
You say the legal person should also be extended. And I don't understand what that means for the legal person to be extended. I thought you said that the legal person should be extended beyond corresponding to the body.
Mm-hmm.
But as you rightly,
yeah.
Person is already extended beyond the body.
Yeah.
So, and how does this add a bit about legal?
Yeah, yeah.
apply to the getting of the information.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. So there's two pieces of it, and one of the I didn't come up in the talk. So it's like it's. I'm glad that you're asking me this. So there's two pieces of it. So it started off with me thinking about just like selves, and how like there's like a view of selves where you can see like that it extends information. There's all kind. And the problem is like I don't actually really want to. Okay, if I'm starting to talk about the self, now I've entered like thousands of years of philosophizing about the self that I don't actually really want or need to take a stand on to make the sort of normative conclusion that I want to make about the law, which is ultimately a functionalist picture of the self that's compatible with, like, it's similar to the sort of extended mind stuff. I'm remaining agnostic on like the actual metaphysics of the self. I just want to give a theory of how the law should understand the self. And so that was what motivated the shift, which didn't even, exactly didn't come up, towards thinking about the legal person. And that both constrained and opened up the sort of vision of the paper. It kind of shifted the vision of the paper. And a part of why I wanted to give you guys this genealogy is I think it's probably cool. I mean, sorry, I shouldn't say it's probably cool to see. You might find it interesting to see like how these projects develop and like the twists and turns they take and like how they can just balloon crazily, right? Once you start talking about them. And so what I realized is, no, what I'm interested in is the self as it's understood in the law's eyes. And it moved me to think about the legal person. Now, you're totally right that like, the way that I describe it in the paper is we recognize the functionalism completely as to corporations. We see glimmers of it in legal persons with individuals. We're not consistent about it. And we haven't wholly like collectively like acknowledged this and internalized it, even though we see glimmers of it. And I think that if we actually did that, we would be much more comfortable with things like these non-economic information interests. And so I'm kind of going back to the basics to sort of open up, show like, yeah, we're already doing this in certain contexts. We just don't frame it that way. And then in other contexts, we're like hyper fetishizing the human body, and we're not able to like recognize non-property interests in these other contexts. And so we need to carry it through. And then the three sort of implications are like my like attempt at spelling out what that would really look like.
So may I just come back?
Yeah.
Okay, so then how about this?
Mm-hmm.
The legal person should fully recognize all the personal rights as well as the extended personal rights of information.
Yeah.
So then I think actually you can very much, you don't need a new theory of legal person, but because on very sort of I guess very easily accepted by mainstream, you can think of the legal person as the avatar, right? As them analog to the avatar of the metaverse, except that your legal person,
right,
the person in the legal world.
Yeah. I mean, that is, so I think a part of the frame, the attachment now to this sort of new, it's theory of legal person, in actual like stuff that people have written about, so like whatever, like Lon Fuller is like the one philosopher who's like written about the legal person, right? And he's got a very deflationary account of it. And thinks like there's not really anything to be said here. And I think a lot of people are like, yeah, corporations plus human individuals, the end. And what I wanted to do is actually, and it's very unlike me because it's kind of like an imminent logic move, which is like very unlike me, but I actually think, and I also think this is another sort of rhetorical move. I think that once we see this context where we're very comfortable, and in the corporations were a solution to a problem. We gave them corporate personhood. Now we have new problems. Let's think about personhood in more sort of imaginative ways. So a part of it is that I think there's I agree with you that I think that like not, and this is maybe like a problem with like scholar brains, like showing the brain, that, you know, if you asked like an ordinary individual, like, what is a legal person? They wouldn't necessarily be like, yeah, it's my human body. Like, it's like, no, it's something. But there is a kind of reductive, in a way that I've come to disagree with, picture where it's like, no, it's just corporations plus human, like biological humans. And so I think we need to sort of expand that vision. And I think that will have a lot of applications to a lot of different things that I haven't, you know, it's fun, again, to talk to people in different areas of law about this, because they have said, like, I see an application here, and I want to open up that possibility, even though, like, I'm interested in like information application. So that's kind of the story. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much for this. Super interesting. So not a philosopher here, so apologies for any ignorance.
No.
I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on how this framework helps us think through some of the issues regarding population harms, collectives. And I guess I'm particularly interested in whether there's any room in this for sort of, I don't know, non-Western liberal possessive individualist cosmologies. This is,
Right.
You know, a major issue, for example, for indigenous groups claiming ownership over blood samples and ownership over DNA.
Right.
Partially based in, you know, a Western, you know, U.S. common law framework, but also partially based in like a totally different cosmology and understanding of ownership.
Absolutely, and you know, identity.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is great, and this was one of the things that I kind of hand waved. You know, one of the things, if we really sort of recognize, we internalize this functionalist picture, what does that entail? And I think it entails three very notable things about the nature of the self, of the person: that we are dynamic, that's obvious, like no one rejects that, right? That we're contextual. It depends on what the sort of functional role is that's being played around us. And then finally, that we can be interrelated. And so the contextual and the interrelated pieces, and I get into this a little bit in like some of the drafts, they entail things like, I think, you know, to some extent, I don't think I'm hesitant to say it's all the way down, but I do think that to some very important extent, your view of what the self is defines what the self is, right? And so I think, you know, these contexts where, and because that, you know, informs the functional role that everything is playing around you, that informs how you define your life and like what that, and so, you know, the one example that I gave in talking about this is the distinction between sort of hyper-individualist American conceptions of the self versus, you know, like, for example, indigenous communities' conceptions of selves, or like more communitarian conceptions of selves. And I think that, you know, what I'm very, very attached to, and this sort of, again, I think one of the kind of, this idea came from the original, but I actually kind of thought that this was another virtue of an ironic virtue of drawing the analogy of the corporations, because it's like, we can do it there, right? So why can't we recognize it in these other contexts as a sort of unified whole? And so that's how I kind of think of it. Now, I don't want to pretend that I think this like solves all of the, like, so, you know, like Salome and I often have this conversation where we say that like we think our views are complementary, like, or not complementary. Is that the right word? I always confuse them. They should both happen, basically. I'm not pretending that everything is solved once we sort of open the door to recognizing, you know, other forms of collective personhood. I don't think that. I think, you know, there's going to be a lot of sort of relational, egalitarian, whatever, class-based like problems that this cannot solve. And I think a lot of what Salome is interested in is that stuff. And so I don't think it solves every problem. And I think you need both solutions. And like, she thinks that you need both solutions, even though she, you know, is sort of associated with this. And we're one day like trying to write a paper where we're like, no, you need both. So I don't pretend that it solves everything, but I do think that it's a tool that is underused, and that is it. Once you recognize it, you ought to be capturing these kinds of differences. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I'm very excited about how you're.
Thank you.
And so my immediate reaction is to try to imagine the worst things possible. And so unfortunately, that's what I did.
Good. That's what I needed. So,
But I am really excited about the things. And I also understand like sort of I think it allows you to make a really nice move in terms of the conversations about AI and how to regulate it.
yeah. Yeah.
Because it's not, it's very nice.
Thank you.
So my fear is this. You basically tied an extended self to narratives that we can produce about ourselves, right? And so whenever I can produce a new narrative about myself, that allows me to like extend myself to a true aspect of the world, right? And I can see this precisely because most people don't have access to the law. Right? Unless you have tons of resources to networks. You can't actually make the law work for you very well. I don't know.
Yeah.
But let's just sort of say that there are many people who cannot access the law. Right? What this means then, in practice, maybe, is that let's say I use a computer, I have it for 10 years, it's an Apple computer, it's very old, but I've searched a lot on it, and it's learned from my searches. It's now can find files very well, but like a new Apple computer could not. Right? Let's say someone runs into my room, breaks that computer. Instead of someone damaging their property, now suddenly it's battered. Now, if I'm very clever and or very rich,
Yeah.
right, or a lot of power, for whatever reason, you can imagine how this would get used in really destructive ways.
Yeah.
Sort of aggregate power.
Yeah.
Right, and sort of, I don't know, maybe self-defeating in some cases for what we would have hoped this conception would have solved. So I'm on board with everything you're saying.
Yeah. No, it's a really helpful point because it is exactly the opposite of what you're right that it's like it's the exact opposite outcome of what precisely motivated the problem, which is why do celebrities get to control their identities purely because they have market power and ordinary individuals do not? And it's like what's going on in both cases, like celebrities are really, they're trying to control their they're trying to control their image and they're just using their market power to do it. And I'm like, this is not chill, right? And so there is this worry, I think, and I think it's a very, very real worry. And I think a part of it is that there have to be, so there's two pieces to it. One is that I think, there's so many pieces to it. And a part of it is I think I just need to kind of chew on it as a great sort of, sort of problem that crystallizes a lot of what I think I have to deal with when I talk about the boundary stuff, and also the limitations of it's related to our dialogue, which is what I said was I want to say to some extent your narrative, but not completely. And there's a black box, right? Like and a part of why part of what I think that the interrelatedness of ourselves is very complex, and I think there's a challenge around when it ceases to be, once we extend ourselves beyond our bodies, now like we can be entangled in various ways, and like how do we define like this is the me part of the information and this is the you part, and mechanisms for tackling this problem. Very unsatisfying answer that I have as to that part, which is distinct from your question. But it's that's what law's whole job is to draw these kinds of lines. But I do think I need to think about what the sort of rail guards are trying to preserve what's an attempt at a fundamentally sort of egalitarian theory of non-economic personal rights. And so I'll be chewing on that. Yeah.
So I'm kind of going back to the beginning, thinking about speech. Another place we talk a lot about selves and self-expression, realization, and I'm curious how you think that relates. And also, I guess there's something in like self-expression and self-realization that points to maybe a different kind of self, right? There's like some sort of like true special self that goes for corporations or realized self, which just has to do with profit, but you also have that for individuals. I'm just curious what you think kind of evolve?
Yeah, it's so great because there's been like a great sort of thread in the questions that have been asked. Yeah, I think, so I'll say, like, just going back to my original interest in this question, right? So I began as like a copyright theorist, and a part of what interested me about copyright is that there's this framing of like this, and I gave you this framing myself. It's like there's the copyright economic interest, and then there's like competing speech claims. But on the other hand, like copyrighted works are literally defined as, they're supposed to be expressive works. And I want it, my like own theory of it is that actually it's a mistake to understand this as this weird like breakdown discontinuity. I actually think that the very same kinds of things that ground our speech, our liberties of expression ought to ground the sort of kinds of integrity of that expression, kinds of considerations, within this sort of extended self kind of framework. It's like a part of you, right? And then I defend a kind of non-economic right there, and it kind of tries to collapse the sort of distinction. But what I say in the copyright context is this only works, this sort of, again, this egalitarian revision of copyright that also sort of tries to create a through line between, the freedom to express yourself and then like the control of the integrity of that expression requires like seriously paring down copyright. Like basically we need to have very, very minimal rights, because then this other artist needs to be able to come along and like express themselves freely. And so it's this kind of rights-based minimalism that I develop. And I think, putting that in conversation with this stuff, it's puzzling how that's going to go, because I'm like a very like into free speech person. And so, I'm trying to, create this framework for shifting how we think about the problem. But I also think that like the competing claims, like my personal view, which is not the view that I gave in the sort of beginning, because again, it was kind of this like, I'm trying to speak to everyone, is a very, it's a personal, like deontic, like liberty, right? And I think so it is both personal considerations that are kind of competing with each other. And I think it raises some so the thing that I wrote about artificial resurrection in the Boston Review, was my attempt at trying to show that this problem is actually really hard. As much as I was horrified by the thought of being resurrected, chatbot Mala, and then my ex is talking to her and then sharing her with people. Maybe he's modifying her, maybe he's selling her online. At the same time, like, what is, if I in the piece I like flip the perspective, it's like, okay, let's say I'm heartbroken. What am I allowed to do? I'm allowed to journal about him. Maybe I'm allowed to like write a novel that's like based on him. Like, where does my conception of you, my narrative of you, when does that get to begin? And when do your sort of rights end? And so it's another sort of angle, I think, to the boundaries question that I don't have all I have is this hand waving about contextual, dynamic, interrelated. But that will be, I think it'll have to be like paper 3. I know that we've gone a little, actually, I didn't know if we went over time. In my mind, it was 1:30, but any other? Well, thank you guys. This was a really, really excellent questions, and it was a lot of fun for me. So thank you for coming.
So